Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Queen Mary for tonight's event on electoral reform in action. My name is Robert Saunders. I'm the Deputy Director of the Mile End Institute here at QMUL. And we're co-hosting this evening's event with an array of different partners, with Make Votes Matter, the Electoral Reform Society, and Unlock Democracy. So in true electoral reform fashion, we have a coalition for you this evening. I'm a historian, so I always like to start an event with a little bit of history. In 1918, Parliament came within hours of abolishing first past the post. So this is the same bill that created universal male suffrage, that gave 8 million women the vote, and it was also meant to abolish first past the post. But the two houses disagreed on what should replace it. The House of Lords wanted proportional representation, the House of Commons wanted the alternative vote, and the bill came really within minutes of the end of the session, which would have meant that the bill failed and the new votes didn't happen. So a compromise was agreed, the bill was allowed to pass, and electoral reform was saved for next year. And we've really been there ever since. And in some ways, that's the starting point for tonight's event. What we wanted to do was to have a different kind of discussion about electoral reform, where instead of focusing on the strengths and weaknesses of first past the post, does it create strong government or elective dictatorship? Does it keep down the extremes or throttle voter choice? And then comparing that with something else called electoral reform, we wanted actually to look in detail at what the alternatives might be. How do they work in practice? What are they designed to do? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And that's something we don't talk about enough, because these systems operate very differently. Some of them are proportional, some of them are not. Some of them are designed to ensure that minorities are fairly represented, some that real majorities rule. Some keep quite a strong geographical link, others doesn't. So if we're going to replace first past the post, we need to think about what we should replace it with. And we need to make sure that we're comparing first past the post with something real, rather than just some ideal, fluffy alternative. So we have 4 excellent panelists this evening who are going to present to us different ways of counting votes and running elections. So, at the end here we have Jess Garland, who is the Director of Research and Policy at the Electoral Reform Society. And she's going to be presenting the single transferable vote, which is, I think, the system that the Electoral Reform Society advocates. It's also the system that's used in the Republic of Ireland, in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and I think in Scottish local government. Then to my right, Rainbow Murray is the Professor of Politics here at Queen Mary, and an expert on elections and political representation. And she's going to be talking about the two-stage or runoff system used particularly in France. And of course, French politics are in the news at the moment for very different reasons. To my left, we have Stephen Gethins, who is the Member of Parliament for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, and who was previously a Professor of Practice at St Andrews. And he's going to be talking about the additional member system, which is used in the Scottish Parliament. And then over on the far left, as it were, we have another of my colleagues, Stijn van Kessel, who is Professor of Comparative Politics at Queen Mary. He's an expert on populism and the radical right. And he's going to be talking about, I think, one of the most proportional systems, the open list system, as used in the Netherlands. So we're going to hear from each of them about how these systems work, talk about some of their strengths and weaknesses, and then we'll throw it open to you for your own questions and thoughts. And then we're going to end the evening with a vote. Not quite sure how we're going to count the votes, but to see which system you find most entrancing. So can we begin, please, by just welcoming our 4 panellists. Jess, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks very much, yes, sure. And I have the pleasure, can you hear me okay? No. Right, hold on. I've probably not switched it on or something very straightforward.
It's working.
Hello? No? Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Now I'm really loud. Okay, so thank you for having me so much to this exciting debate, and I have the pleasure of presenting to you the STV, Single Transferable Vote System. And as Robert said, this is used in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scottish local elections, so this is very familiar to our Isles here. And of course, I'm seeing some familiar faces in the audience, and I'm sure you probably don't need me to explain how STV works, but I'm going to do that as that was the brief. So let me give you a very quick overview. So STV, for those of you who don't know it, is both proportional and preferential. And that's, I think, great for voters because you get an outcome that's more closely matched to how voters have voted, but also as a voter, you get more of what you want. You get more from your vote, and I'm going to explain how that happens with the system in a minute. Now, STV uses multi-member constituencies, so you have more than one representative for your area. Your constituency is slightly larger, and you typically have between 3 and 6 members. So you think this might be a little bit like council elections in England and Wales, where you typically would have maybe 3 people representing your ward. So different from a list-based system. It's also a candidate-based system. So when you go to vote, you're choosing between candidates, not just a party. Obviously, candidates within parties as well. So as the voter, what do you do? When you get your ballot paper, you're not putting down a cross, you're actually putting preferences, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So you put a 1 for your first preference, 2 for your second preference, etc. And in most systems, you can vote for you can put as many or as few preferences down as you wish. The more preferences you use, the more your vote's going to contribute. And those preferences are going to direct how your vote transfers in the next stage if your first preference candidate is either elected or eliminated. Okay, so now bear with me while I give a very brief overview of the science bit. There are variations of this system. I'm not going to go into that. We don't have time. Happy to answer questions if anyone wants to. But under all the versions of the system, you first calculate the quota. That's the number of votes you need to get over the line. Then you sort all the votes by the first preferences, and any candidate over the quota is elected. If no one meets that quota, then the candidate with the least number of first preferences is eliminated, and the votes transferred to the second preferences. If someone does get across the line on that first round, then any votes above the quota are then transferred to second preferences. And this process goes on, third preferences, fourth preferences, until you've filled the number of positions that you have available. Now, that all sounds a bit technical, but as the voter, you don't need to know any of that. That's all behind the scenes. That's where the magic happens. Looks great. And, you know, if you see people counting by hand, it's really an interesting process, and some people love that. But as the voter, you don't need to know what happens behind the scenes because you're just choosing who you want. And it's good for voters on that basis because if the person that you first preference isn't elected or they're eliminated, your other preferences come into play. So there's no wasted votes, and there's no need for tactical voting of the sort that we might see where you're kind of having to second guess the system. The system's doing all of that work for you. And of course you can choose the candidate as well as the party that you like. So you can choose between candidates within a party, and of course you can vote for different parties. You know, split ticket voting is quite common under STV. And of course you can vote for candidates who don't have a party, and STV is typically quite fair to independent candidates as well. Now, I don't know how I'm doing for time there, Robert, whether I should go on to some of the other benefits of STV or leave it there.
Stay with the benefits.
Okay, well, let me just give you a quick rundown of the benefits. I think in terms of broader democratic values, because you've got this preferencing, you tend to see a bit less of that negative campaigning. You know, if in some systems where you want to do down your opponent's voters, you know, keep them at home, you know, there's an electoral benefit to sort of trying to suppress other votes. Whereas here you might be picking up second and third preferences. So in terms of turnout, there is a kind of inbuilt side to get people out. And of course, you might think, well, certain people aren't going to vote for you, but sometimes you look at transfers and people will put things which look quite confusing, you know, a preference over here on the political spectrum and another one over here. So, you know, it's always worth going for those other preferences. Typically as well, we've got these multi-member constituencies, so it's really in parties' interest to put up a more diverse slate of candidates. That's not a panacea for diversity in politics, but it does help. And then, of course, you get parliaments and authorities that more closely resemble how people have voted in the diversity of opinion in a country or in an authority. So When it was introduced in Scotland for local elections, a lot of councils were single party, completely single party, and there isn't a single council like that now in Scotland, much more diverse in terms of parties and views. And of course, because of the increased competition as well, you don't have these uncontested seats, which aren't worth parties competing. There's a much higher level of competition within the system. I think I'll leave it there and then pass it on.
Thank you. Could I just ask one quick follow-up
Absolutely.
before we move on to Rainbow? I know it's a question that's often asked about the single transferable vote. It sounds very complicated. How do you make sure that voters know what they're doing?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And it's really important that, you know, particularly at that point, if you were going to change the system, that you're really clear on the difference, and that people, because obviously it's easy to put two first preferences down, or of course if you don't know what you're doing. And I know in places where we do, including like Australia and places with a single transferable vote, they really encourage the poll staff not to try and explain how the counting works, because there's a lot of possibility to get that wrong, and also to confuse voters. So there's a lot of campaigns out there like it's easy as 1, 2, 3, you know, just really focusing on what the voter needs to do in terms of putting those numbers down rather than across, and just keeping it at that level. And of course, you're not then trying to explain the tactical voting part of it, or the how you work the system. It's really straightforwardly who do you like and in what order.
Okay, thank you. Rainbow, would you like to tell us about France?
Thank you very much. Okay, so France has a 2-round election system. So you go to the polls twice, normally a couple of weeks apart. I think it's 2 weeks apart for one of the elections, 1 week. Anyways, never mind. In the first round, it's a bit of a free-for-all that anyone can stand. And so, in theory, you can have a wide proliferation of parties standing. In practice, sometimes parties will form pacts ahead of the first round, divide up seats to avoid splitting their votes too much from the get-go. But it does allow for a broader party system than you see in the UK, and greater presence of smaller parties. And the parties who gain at least 12.5% of the registered electorate qualify to the second round. Why do I say the registered electorate rather than voters? It's an important distinction, because you have to get 12.5% of all potential voters, whether they turn out or not, which means turnout matters in these elections. If you have high levels of abstention, then that threshold is harder to achieve. So even though you only need, in theory, 12.5% of the vote, if only 50% of people turn out, that's suddenly 25%, which is a harder ceiling to achieve. And only the people who reach that threshold are then eligible to run off in the second round. And so in the second round, you have whoever's qualified facing off, and at that point, whoever gets the most votes wins, quite similar to the UK. It becomes a plurality. Although if you only have 2 candidates, which is the case in the majority of races, then you will see whoever gets the magic 50% win. But sometimes you can have 3 candidates, what the French call a triangulaire, a triangle, occasionally even 4. And sometimes when you have 2 candidates from the same side of the political spectrum, they might be just strategic. One of them might stand down, normally the one that had the lowest score at the end of the first round, to avoid splitting the vote and letting the other side in. So you do get some tactical play going on in the second round. And there are distinctive pros and cons to organising an election this way. The first advantage is that it allows you to vote with the heart and with the head. So people say, in the first round you vote with your heart. You vote for whichever candidate you're most attuned to, who you think should most be in power. But then you get a second chance in the second round to vote strategically. And so in the second round, you're voting with the head, you're voting for whichever of the remaining candidates is the least offensive to you. It allows a party system that has a larger number of smaller parties, but historically has still allowed for the formation of stable governments. Generally, parties have aligned themselves into a left or right bloc, which is visible in the strategic alliances formed, especially in the second round. And you also get a strong constituency link because this electoral system is still organised through single-member constituencies. So each of those members of parliament represents a distinct territory. I've interviewed a lot of French MPs. They take that constituency link really seriously. It's a major part of their representative role. So those are the advantages. The disadvantage is that one of the previous advantages of this system has recently fallen apart, which was that it was for a long time seen as a way of protecting the country from extremist parties because they struggled to meet that key threshold at the end of the first round. If they did get into the second round, the other parties could gang up against them and stop them getting in. So much so that it was only when France, as a one-off, experimented with proportional representation in 1986. That was when the far right got their first breakthrough into Parliament. And one of the first things that the incoming government did was get rid of PR and go back to the two-round system, at which point the far right disappeared again pretty much from Parliament until 2022, when they came back with a vengeance. And this has been a sort of bigger problem with this two-round system is that it has struggled to adapt to recent changes in the French party system. So we had this traditional left-right bloc, and we have seen that ebb away. And we now have a system where we have a strong centre, a far left and a far right. And this particular electoral system has struggled to adapt to this change in the party system. And so one consequence is that we no longer see that other benefit that I mentioned of stable governments. And we've seen in the last two parliaments, the one elected in 2022 and again in 2024 for an unusual snap election, both resulted in a hung parliament. And especially that most recent one in 2024, we've now got three big blocs in the French parliament of about the same size, who can't agree with each other on anything, which has created real volatility in French politics. So the system is now being called into a question. For a long time, it was seen as a really good electoral system. But in the 21st century, it is struggling to continue to deliver its historic advantages. And last but not least, it can also lead to a degree of election fatigue. And that's particularly the case given that most often in France, the parliamentary elections come directly in the wake of the presidential election, which is also held over 2 rounds. So you can end up going to the polls 4 times in 2 months. And we do see the turnout declines as people gradually lose interest in taking part in elections. I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Actually, on that point, I was just developing that final point. I was thinking as you spoke of someone who I'm sure will be remembered with affection by many in this room, which is Brenda from Bristol, who was famously told there would be an election in 2017 and replied, "What? Another one?" I mean, is there a sense of, what happens between the first and the second stage? Does it feel more real and therefore more urgent at the second stage, or are people simply exhausted by that stage?
Well, again, if you come directly in the wake of the presidential elections, you do see the turnout starts to fall away in the parliamentary elections, especially if they're seen as a foregone conclusion, which for a long time they were if they just, gave the president a parliamentary majority. But again, that's changed recently. But it also depends on what your goal is in voting. So there are some people who only vote in the first round because they're voting for a small minority party. They know that party's not going to get into government. They just want to turn out and make sure that their voice is heard. And they do get an opportunity to do that in the first round. Then in the second round, it's I don't like him versus I don't like her, and they can't be bothered. Other people are more concerned about who actually forms a government, and they see the second round as the more important one because that is the final decision-making point. So you don't necessarily get an identical electorate for both rounds.
Great, thank you very much. Stephen, could you tell us about Scotland?
Of course, yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me along today. I'm going to talk to you about the additional member system, but just for my ease of reference, let's call it the Holyrood Scottish Parliament system. So very basically, you get 2 votes for each Scottish Parliament election. You get a constituency vote and you get a regional list vote, and it's just a cross in the box for each of them. The constituency work is very straightforward. For the constituency list, first past the post, 73 constituencies, which corresponds to the 72 Westminster constituencies that existed when the Scottish Parliament was re-established in 1999. but you get an additional one because Orkney and Shetland are split into 2 seats to make up for the geographical nature of the island seats. So there's 73 of those seats, and there are 56 regional list seats. Now, critically, you don't get a first and a second vote, you get 2 distinctive votes. So your first past the post, if you like, constituency vote, very straightforward, same as constituency at Westminster. For the regional list vote, for the number of votes that you get in each region, and there are 8 electoral regions, and just to give you an idea for those who know Scotland, you get Highlands and Islands, North East, South of Scotland, Glasgow, etc. Each 8 regional lists with about 8 MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, elected in each. And the number, this is where it gets complex, the number who are elected on the regional list is how many votes you've got, but not quite divided by 8, but divided by 8 and then also subtracting the number of constituency votes that you've got as well. So you get, if you've had no constituency MSPs in a particular region, then you can make up for it on the list. If you've got lots of constituency MSPs elected, you will not get members on the list. And that's what gives you your proportionality, is that regional list. And what we've seen in the Scottish Parliament are proportional parliaments have been elected consistently in Scotland. What are the pros of that? It means that because you've got the constituency list and the regional list, that local connection is maintained, both at a regional level and at a constituency level as well. It's broadly proportionate. In all of the Scottish parliaments we've had elected since 1999, there's only been one majority government when the SNP managed to break the system, and that resulted in the independence referendum in 2014, when, as well as winning all the constituency seats in some areas in the North East, for example, it won an additional regional list as well, given the way it was worked out with the division of seats. And effectively, even though there are 2 different votes, there are no wasted votes. So if your party becomes second just, and a similar proportion will vote for it on the regional list, you will see your party will be compensated for just missing out on the constituency vote via the regional list vote. So there's less capacity for wasted votes. It also means that, and I think it was being mentioned earlier on, what we've got increasingly in UK politics is people voting for a party because they don't like the other party. That becomes more difficult. So, for example, if the SNP is doing well, but you don't like the SNP, you vote for another party, the SNP will most likely make up for that on the regional list vote because they remain popular. So no wasted votes. What's also interesting, given that proportional system, is all the Scottish parliamentary terms have gone full term since 1999. No snap elections, no chaos, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, but I also want to cover some of the downsides. Some of the downsides are that elections, is that there's a possibility that you could game the system. So, for example, in Scotland, the Conservative Party are the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. So if they were to fight the constituency as the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, and then the list is the Scottish Unionist and Conservative Party, that could be a way to game it, although the Electoral Commission will probably have something to say about that. There's sometimes a little bit of tension between the constituency and the list MSPs, although both are considered absolutely equal within Parliament by the presiding officer, with equal resources given to them as well. But sometimes maybe that little bit of competition is no bad thing. Also, elections can take longer and make decision-making more complex. But then that's the decision-maker's problem rather than the voter's problem. A couple of differences I'd highlight. This was introduced in 1999 when there was cross-party consensus. There should be a proportionate system for the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament itself was not modelled on Westminster with the 2 sides, but rather a hemicycle. And that was meant to be reflective of the kind of politics that we wanted to see in Scotland. It has meant a different culture of governance. So, for example, when the SNP first won power, there were 47 SNP MSPs, 46 Labour, 18 Conservatives, 17 Liberals, 2 Greens. That made things complex, but the Scottish Government went full term, passed all of its budgets, and it had to speak and engage with every other party. And it also meant that all the opposition parties had to engage with the government as well. So it took on board that idea of responsible opposition. And just finally, somebody who's a Westminster MP, that change in the culture of governance that we've seen in Holyrood has been quite striking, because we've had all these governments in Scotland that are either minority governments or coalition governments, with one exception, being that majority government after 2011. And as somebody who sat in the Parliament in 2017 in Westminster, when Theresa May was just short of a majority, and the government felt like it was going to collapse in a heap every week, I think that was reflective of the culture that Westminster really struggled with, a culture whereby one party didn't have a majority. And actually that spoke to the culture within the governing party, but also within the opposition party as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that there are these 2 different kinds of representatives, and you said that the presiding officer is very careful to treat them in the same way. What about the public? Is there any sense that they have a different status with the public, or that one type has a bigger workload than the other because it has constituency-based work? How does that work out?
So what we find is that constituency MSPs tend to have bigger case workloads, because if you get in touch with your local MSP through the website, for example, it will list all your MSPs. So you've got your constituency MSP first, and then you've got a choice of 7 or 8 regional list MSPs, and so you tend to go for the top one. However, where this introduces a little bit of competition is that regional list MSPs ultimately many of them will aspire to be a constituency MSP, because there are proportionately slightly more constituency MSPs than there are regional list MSPs. And if you want to be in government in Scotland, you need to be winning a good chunk of the constituency, a good chunk of the constituencies. And what that means is you'll often see regional list MSPs trying to carve out a particular role for themselves locally, which is something that all elected representatives will seek to do, and seek to give themselves some local legitimacy, profile, that they hope will enhance their own prospects and the prospects of their party as well. And finally, I didn't say the regional list is a closed list, so that's set by the party.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stijn, can you tell us about the system in the Netherlands?
I'm going to use some slides, otherwise I get lost in the technicalities of my own system from the Netherlands.
Have you got the mic?
I think so. Tom, do you know where the slides are? They're already on the screen. Oh, there we go. Yes. So this is. Where was the clicker again? The key? Sorry. Oh, here. Wait. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm there. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Dutch. Can you hear me without microphone? Or?
No, can you use it?
Use it. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the Dutch open list, pure proportional representation system that's used for the Dutch lower house. The Dutch Senate uses an indirect way of getting elected, which is slightly odd, but I'm focusing on this one. This is the more important.
Can you stand over there, because the screens are in the way, I didn't know.
Okay, pardon, yeah. So yeah, this is the lower house, like in the UK, is the more important house of parliament. So yeah, this is a pure proportional representation system mainly for 2 reasons. So a lot of countries in Europe use some form of PR, but the Netherlands is pure for 2 main reasons. Effectively, the whole country is 1 electoral district, which increases proportionality, and there's also hardly an effective threshold. Although, as I learned today when doing my homework, actually there are electoral districts, but the votes are distributed in Parliament based on the overall nationwide vote, which makes this system one of the most proportional systems around. So this is basically how it looks when someone goes to vote. At least in the Netherlands, as a voter abroad, I get a much simplified version of this sheet, which is interested, or I get a PDF of what you see here on the screen, and the ballot looks a bit more simple. But this is when you go voting by hand in the Netherlands. So you see a lot of rows with rounds, one of which you have to fill out. So all the rows, all the columns rather, they represent the list of one party. The candidates on the list are purely determined by the central party. The lists may vary a little bit according to the province or the district where you vote. However, it tends to be, especially the top part of the list, tend to be the same across the country with the same candidates. So you have a choice to vote on the candidates. You can't actually vote for the party as such. You have to vote for one particular candidate. Most people would vote, as this person does, for the party leader, the most well-known candidate of that party. Some voters might choose to elect the first woman on the list, which is also quite a common thing to do, more and more so, actually, research shows. However, the effect this has, so you might vote for someone lower on the list because you might some form of protest, or you like that particular candidate. However, that will probably not have a huge impact on whether that candidate gets into parliament. So in most cases, depending on how many votes a certain party gets, it follows the list down until the candidates are depleted, or the party does not get any further candidates elected into parliament. So what I'm trying to say, the party has a large influence, a very large influence on who the candidates are on the list that it presents. Most voters will actually not know candidates lower on the list. There's no local representative, one of the downsides, you might say, of this electoral system. So there's hardly any constituency link, given that the list is the same more or less across the whole country. So most people on the list will be unknown to voters, and constituency orientations is almost by definition low. So that's what it looks like. And this is the result. So fragmentation is kind of a key word of Dutch party politics, and that's why I thought it might be useful to show just how fragmented it is. So these are all the parties, almost all of whom have a seat in parliament. So from PVV, which is the radical right party of Geert Wilders, you see that's the red column. In the latest election, he became the largest party, or his party became the largest, up until Ja21, which is another radical right party. There are at least 2 radical right parties, or extreme right parties, even represented in parliament, which might be a topic for discussion also. So yeah, very fragmented, because basically all votes count. Only the votes for the parties that get fewer than 0.67% of the vote, because that is the effective electoral threshold. You need 0.67% of the vote in order to get a seat in parliament. And that's basically mathematical, because there are 150 seats in Dutch parliament, so that effectively means that you need 0.67% of the vote, which is about 70,000 votes, I think, in the last election, or in the last decades or so. Fragmentation, what you can also see, if this works. So this is, no, it doesn't work, never mind. But what I basically want to show is that the percentage of seat is pretty much the same as the percentage of vote is pretty much equal to the percentage of seats a party gets into parliament, so very proportional. Oh, yeah, I'm back again, yeah. So yeah, representation and fragmentations are 2 of the key words of the Dutch system of, the electoral system leading to this type of effect in terms of parliamentary representation. So a lot of parties being represented, but also fragmentation of the system. Niche parties are offered a chance of representation quite easily, given that they need less than 1% of the vote, they can already get a seat. So some examples are here. SGP, which is the Orthodox Christian party, has been around for a long time. They have very stable support in some of the very religious villages. Denk is a party that represents a Muslim minority population. 50 plus is for the party representing the slightly older members of society. BBB is a large party now, which is the Farmers Party, which is in coalition currently, Partij voor de Dieren, the Party for the Animals, has also a few seats. The Forum for Democracy, that you might say it's beyond radical right. You might now say that that is a radical right or extreme right party, which is also quite cozy with Vladimir Putin. As it's been shown that the party has received funding, and they are still represented in parliament with 3 seats at the moment. So yeah, clearly there are some radical or even extreme parties represented in Dutch parliament. It also means that it's virtually unthinkable that a party would get an outright majority. So you always need a coalition formation process after the election. Currently, we have a rather shaky 4-party coalition, and that's largely to do with the fact that these traditionally dominant mainstream parties are not dominant so much anymore at all. So the PVDA is the Dutch Labour Party, now is merging with the Green Party, basically out of desperation, or that is a pessimistic view. The Liberal VVD and the CDA used to be the very dominant Christian Democratic Party. Now it's a shadow of its former self. So it becomes more and more difficult to form a government with fewer than 4 parties, because there are not these dominant large parties anymore as they used to be like a few decades ago. It also took almost a year or 2/3 of a year in order to form this coalition government, and as some of you might know, or many of you might know, it also includes the radical right Freedom Party, which won the latest election, became the largest. By the way, in the Netherlands, it's also hard to say who wins the election. Clearly, the PVV, the radical right party, won the election. It more than doubled its seat share, but it's not always so obvious. Who are the winners and the losers? Because there's not one party that ultimately is able to form a government, and even if you win an election, you might still end up in opposition because of the coalition negotiation process behind doors. Okay, the question is, but we can discuss this perhaps more in depth later because I'm rambling on a bit too long, I think. So does the system need fixing? That's the big question. Fragmentation can be seen as a problem, certainly as it becomes unclear to the voters what kind of government is going to form when one votes for a certain party. However, some of my colleagues in the Netherlands are still very die-hard defenders of this system, because they argue this open system, it's easy for new parties, for challengers to break through. It incentivizes inclusion of certain minority groups and also responsiveness to new political issues and demands, because mainstream parties are constantly under pressure from potential challengers, so they have to listen carefully to changing demands within society. Is fragmentation a sign of chaos? Not so much. There are all these different parties, but clearly the parties are sort of clustered in larger ideological, some of these parties are quite like-minded. So the Party for the Animals votes most of the time with the Greens. So these parties are quite similar in terms of ideological nature, and voters also know that. So they switch between relatively like-minded ideological or parties that are reasonably ideologically like-minded. So it's not as chaotic as it might seem, because there are sort of larger ideological blocks to which these parties belong. Is far-right success a function of electoral institutions? No, it's much more complex. There is, the radical right is clearly doing very well in the Netherlands. It's also doing very well in other countries. But part of the reason why the PVV won so big is not so much changes of attitudes of Dutch voters. It's largely to do with party agency or the behavior of mainstream parties. So why did the PVV become so big? If you compare its result with between 2023 and 2021, well, the important part of the reason is that the Liberal VVD opened the possibility to form a coalition with the party. It said during the 23 elections, well, we're not ruling out governing with the PVV anymore. That gave a lot of voters the idea, okay, vote for the radical right PVV is not wasted anymore. So they made the decision to vote for the party. So it's not only institutions, it's also about mainstream parties opening the door for the radical right to form coalitions with them, or legitimizing their agenda by moving closer to their political agenda. Yeah, and I would also say in a two-party system you might even have a bigger problem if the radical right becomes one of the two key challengers, or when a mainstream parties basically turn radical right. So yeah, sorry, I've spoken a little bit too long.
No, thank you. Just one quick follow-up. You mentioned at the end how long it took to form a government after the recent elections. And I think that's quite an unfamiliar phenomenon in Britain, where if it takes a few days to form a government, there's a sense of panic. Who is running the country when it's taking a year to form a government?
Yeah, it's basically the previous government, which becomes a caretaker government, and it cannot make controversial decisions in theory, but sometimes it's necessary if there's an international crisis or so. But yeah, but the current government continues to govern until a new government is formed. Oh.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to hand over now to Steve Gilmore from Unlock Democracy, who is going to give us an opportunity on the basis of what we've heard to vote for how we should vote. This could become incredibly circular, couldn't it? But Steve, do you want to take the mic and tell us what we have to do?
That was somewhat unexpected, but I wasn't expecting to have to speak as well as run the voting. So I confess I do not have the Electoral Reform Society's database or technology at my fingertips, which possibly would have enabled us to do a form of reallocating of the votes live. Instead, we have, if you go to slido.com, enter the digits on the screen or scan the QR code, you'll see that there is a question which says, which systems do you prefer? Select up to 5 in order of preference. And it's ranked choice, so there is an element of preferential voting. However, we won't arrive at a majority consensus, but it will at least give a flavour of the opinion in the room.
Sorry, I'm afraid some of us are living in the Stone Age and don't have the...
Nor do I. What I'll do perhaps is I'll take a hand ballot as well. Once we've got, how long does it take for this to...
Well, we've got 16 votes coming in.
Pouring in, gosh.
Does that mean if I put my hand up now, I can vote twice?
Ha! Yes. There's extraordinary opportunities for corruption and fraud in this system.
So, Robert, if you look at the screen.
So here we are. So it looks like, oh, it's changing all the time. Where's Jonathan Dimbleby when you need him?
Download it.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to do this on a trust basis. Those of you who, like me, haven't got a mobile phone with you, or like me, just don't know how to do this sort of stuff, how many of you do you think that you would vote for, let's take the same order, for the single transferable vote as used in Ireland? Yeah. Goodness, thickets of votes. Scotland, the additional member system. Oh, it's close. The 2-round runoff system in France. The Netherlands open list system. And who, after all of this, would just keep first past the post? Okay, I think that is a narrow victory on both measures for Ireland, for the Irish over the Scottish system. So thank you very much. I think we're out of time now. So thank you for coming this evening. We're going to move next door. There's a glass of wine so we can continue the conversation. You can state your desire to know more about these different electoral systems. But before we move next door, please can we thank our 4 speakers this evening for helping us understand these systems.